The picture is now etched in our minds, but still horrifying.
In one cruel moment, our exhilaration turned to horror. We waited and watched and tried to make sense of what we had seen.
It didn't seem fair that someone that innocent could die.
We saw it explode, but we really didn't know it exploded.
I thought the shuttle was in one piece in the water. I really didn't think that they'd be dead.
We'd seen so many launches, we knew that something was wrong.
We knew at a certain point. In fact, I just started to shake and I couldn't hold the camera any longer.
She was just a real caring, kind person. She's kind of like a big sister to me, kind of. She's just really special.
At the American Embassy in London, the lights burned late this evening as staff received messages of sympathy from the government, the British people and American citizens in this country. The ambassador, Charles Price, who'd watched the tragedy unfold on television in his second-floor office, summed up the reaction of his countrymen.
Well, I think it was one of extraordinary shock and a feeling of immense sorrow for the families who have suffered as a result of this tragic accident.
Did you find that people stopped for a moment in the embassy when they realized what was happening?
Well, I think everything came to an abrupt halt.
His fellow Americans in London were equally stunned by the news.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's like devastating. Should put us back a couple of years.
I'll say.
You know, we have a lot of pride in it. The crew and the astronauts, and for have something like this happen, it's kind of hard to put into words exactly. You just never expected it.
But the shock wasn't confined to Americans. British businessmen from the space industry saw the accident for the first time as they arrived for their association's dinner. While some couldn't hide their emotions, others were already weighing up the harsh commercial realities of the shuttle failure.
The exact effect of today's disaster is far too early to be specific about it. But in general terms, the situation we are faced with is that the shuttle has been sold as a very reliable launch vehicle. It has to be reliable because it carries up to 7 astronauts on each flight. It has been rated as a very reliable vehicle, and we have seen today an inevitable total loss.
I think it will hold back the business world from investing in the possible future opportunities until such times as it's deemed reliable.
While Britain's space technologists observed a silent moment in memory of the American astronauts who died today, the aerospace minister was already considering Britain's own manned satellite, Skynet 4, due to be launched this June.
The Skynet 4 A and B satellites are going to be launched, due to be launched by Shuttle, and that is a Ministry of Defence programme, and they must decide on that.
But it's almost inconceivable, isn't it, now that a British person should go up in space in June?
Well, I would imagine that the Ministry of Defence will want to be totally satisfied that the project was as safe as it can be. But it is worth saying that we have got used to space travel not being on the front page anymore. We're starting to take it for granted, and it is a reminder of the great risks that are still involved and the very brave men and women who come forward to push out the frontiers of modern travel. They're very brave and they deserve our thanks and our appreciation, but there are great risks involved still in space travel.
In the little town nearby, which felt so close to the people at Cape Canaveral, the streets were almost deserted. People at home or in bars and restaurants hungry for the latest news.
The picture is now etched in our minds, but still horrifying. The disastrous end of the 25th shuttle mission.
We'd seen so many launches, we knew that something was wrong.
You could tell.
That's bad.
How has it affected the town here? Because obviously you're all pretty close to the whole operation.
It's just depressing. Because you feel like that's sort of part of your thing, I don't know, here.
It's now just after dawn here at Cape Canaveral and just 19.5 hours since Challenger disappeared. NASA have imposed a news blackout overnight, and in truth, that's because they have very little news to give. The continuing search has yielded very little debris, and in fact, they've appealed to members of the public living here to take to the beaches this morning to search for more. Only one thing can be said for certain, and that is that shuttle missions will continue from here. The question is, when? Ken Reese, News at 1, Cape Canaveral.
Reg Tenniel, there is no black box on a mission like this. So, as the investigators get to work, how will they be able to establish exactly what happened?
Well, although there's no black box, of course, there are hundreds, if not even thousands, of parameters of information being sent back by sensors. But all the indications so far are that the solution doesn't lie there. I think what they're looking for at the moment is, just as in the case of a wrecked aircraft, they're looking for clues in the wreckage. And as far as I can see, there are two vital areas that they'll be looking at. One is that if they can find some of the wreckage of the fuel lines and things like that, they want to know if they did rupture, and could that have been due to the fact that Challenger was hanging about on that launch pad rather longer than it ought to have been, in rather more severe weather than it normally endures. It was a very cold night the night before the launch. That's one thing they'll be looking at. Another big feature is that the big satellite being carried in the payload bay, called TDRS-2, weighed 18 tons with its upper stage, an enormous object. Could that have shifted when the throttles were opened and the speed increased to 104% of engine power? If that shifted, it could well be disastrous. So there are several areas like that that wreckage might help them to resolve.
The flags which fly at half-mast in Concord, New Hampshire, do not reveal the full extent of the anguish here. Christa McAuliffe, the Concord teacher who perished on Challenger, was a local girl who became a local heroine. They all knew her in the town, all saw that devastating explosion on live network television, were all stunned by her death, are all now united in sympathy for her husband Stephen and 2 children.
It's very hard to express how we feel about her, especially Steve and the children, and gosh, it's just awfully hard. The pain is just too much. And if I'm feeling bad and I'm trying to compose myself, I can imagine how they feel. It's just from pride and joy and ecstasy to, excuse me, pain and agony. It's just awfully hard.
The high school where Christa McAuliffe taught was closed today. No one feels the grief more intensely than her former pupils. One moment cheering the shuttle launch, the next watching in horror. She was a close friend to them. The school has arranged for psychologists to talk to those unable to cope with the anguish.
Oh, she's so nice. She's just a real caring, kind person. She's like she's kind of like a big sister to me, kind of. She's just really special. It's hard for me to talk, but she was really special to me. Something like this just wasn't expected, and it's just really hard.
They cried. They were crestfallen. They were extremely somber. They were shocked. They were in disbelief. I'm not so sure that yesterday they were really comprehending exactly what did happen, and I guess myself and all of the staff here for at least 25 minutes or so after the accident happened didn't want to believe the worst, and were hoping that somebody would say, it's all right, it's okay. You know, they made it back.
I'm going to show you what the most important thing
The town's younger children went to pray for Christa McAuliffe in a special service this morning. It was an occasion for optimism as much as sorrow, as they sang, "May our tears turn to dancing." This is a small and tightly knit community. Its people were fiercely proud of the recognition the space shuttle had brought. While America mourns a national disaster, the people of Christa McAuliffe's hometown grieve over what for them is an intensely personal tragedy. Tim Ewart, News at 10, Concord, New Hampshire.
At dawn this morning, as soon as light allowed, a flotilla of boats set out from ports along the Florida coast to resume the search for wreckage. Among them, Coast Guard cutters and specialist scientific vessels. Helicopters covered the beaches inshore, looking for anything that might have been washed in. Firemen rode motorcycles. The public joined in as well.
We know there's debris washing up on the beach. We need every piece of that, because we don't know where the clue might be.
And soon they began to find clues, scattered pieces of wreckage, presumed at this stage to be from the Shuttle Challenger. They were carefully removed from the beach, labelled, and taken away to a local Air Force base where their examination will begin. Almost none of the pieces could be directly identified as coming from the downed shuttle. Police patrolled the beaches, picking up pieces from passers-by. Who gave you that? One of the people looking?
Yeah, one of the people just walking down the street.
Just in case it might be a piece?
Yeah, just in case.
And many more small pieces were found, like this apparent tile. The biggest piece to come back from sea, a 10x4 section, possibly one of these pieces seen dramatically falling into the sea immediately after the explosion and found by a Coast Guard.
I was just hoping it would be maybe the piece that they were in and that they were still alive. Hope.
But no hope today at the small hotels where grieving family members were packing up and going home. Their moment of triumph turned to appalling tragedy. I talked to the cousin of Christa McAuliffe.
I was filming the whole thing. I think I have it all on the film, but we knew at a certain point. In fact, I just started to shake and I couldn't hold the camera any longer. We knew there was something wrong. I think anyone standing there knew something was wrong.
As the families return home to their grief, NASA are still asking the question, what happened, and getting precious little in the way of an answer. So far, the only positive statement to come out of here is that come what may, the shuttle missions will continue one day. Ken Rees, News at 10, Cape Canaveral.
Well, throughout the last 25 years of manned spaceflight, there has been this continuing debate about the enormous cost of putting people into orbit compared with the relative simplicity of unmanned systems. And the next major goal for NASA in space, the space station of the 1990s, is still in hot contest with many elements who say it should be an unmanned robotic space station rather than the kind of permanently manned facility that's planned.
But do you think that this tragedy is going to mean that there's an argument against putting men into space?
I think it will strengthen the cause of those who oppose manned spaceflight, but in the end I think the manned program will prevail.
What about the future for shuttles, the returnable vehicle?
Clearly there's several months before the shuttle can fly again into space, even if the problem is resolved very quickly.
But it's, from what President Reagan said, it's not going to be so much of a setback that it's going to stop them.
I think it will be a very serious blow to the whole program for several years. The knock-on effects of this are quite significant.
The shuttle program has always had a strong defense element, and last year the Pentagon used 2 top-secret, purely military shuttle missions to put spy satellites like this one into orbit. 4 more such missions were planned for this year, with a special new base for them in California. Nevertheless, concern about the 4 NASA shuttles' reliability has made the Pentagon skeptical about becoming too dependent on them for launching the satellites that are increasingly vital to Western defense. Thus, expendable launchers like this Titan rocket have been maintained as backups. So just how much has yesterday's tragedy put back the American military space program?
We can't really say until we know what the problem is with the shuttle. If it turns out to be a one-off fault, then it could be just no more than a few months, and some of the missions planned for later this year could get off the ground. But if it turns out to be a generic design fault in the shuttle, then it could be that all 3 will be grounded for a year or 18 months while the problem is ironed out, in which case it will throw the launch schedules into some disarray.
But what of plans to put Britain's first man into space on the shuttle, along with 3 British-made Skynet communications satellites, one of which would have improved links with the Falklands? Yesterday's disaster might also hang a question mark over the future of the American Strategic Defense Initiative, the SDI, or Star Wars. The shuttle program was in part the first stage of the development of weapons in space that was to lead to President Reagan's vision of a space-based shield against nuclear missiles. But the research program still has far to go, and is unlikely to be too badly affected by this setback.
If the delay isn't too long, if it's just of the order 3 or 4 months, it shouldn't be too serious, because as you say, SDI is just a research program. The actual hardware isn't being built. Some of the missions the military missions this year probably were carrying experiments for SDI. Now, certainly there was a June 1987 mission planned with a Skylab, with a Spacelab payload aboard that was purely for SDI. Now, hopefully that mission won't be affected unless the shuttle is grounded for a year.
The Pentagon says their shuttle is still 5 or 6 years ahead of the Soviet system, a craft superficially similar to the American vehicle, but with a far larger fuel tank. Nevertheless, experts say it still can't boost the shuttle into orbit. Meanwhile, the Russians are developing a smaller space plane, about a third of the size of the US shuttle. This would be a quick response vehicle capable of intercepting satellites, but not designed to carry heavyweight cargoes. So far, it's only been tested using smaller-scale unmanned models, though there are thought to be plans for an early manned launch. All in all, though, Soviet space researchers will have to run very hard to catch up with what is still a commanding American lead, despite the shuttle setback.
At a special mass for Christa McAuliffe, the local teacher who was killed on Challenger, the people of Concord, New Hampshire, gather to share their sorrow. Now the initial shock has gone, there remains here a sense of bereavement, as though a member of the family has been lost. It's hardly a private grief. Concord is mourning in front of a nation which has immersed itself in anguish. The town's young people have found themselves the focus of attention because of their close personal relationship with a teacher everyone seemed to like.
It's hard to think of someone that you know, dying. They were just so helpless, and it didn't seem fair that someone that innocent could die.
We were watching it, and we saw it explode, but we really didn't know it exploded because we were so excited. We weren't looking for something to go wrong. We're just like, oh, that's supposed to happen.
I had hope for them, and I thought it was just the shuttle was in one piece in the water. I really didn't think that they'd be dead.
The high school will have its own very private service for Christa McAuliffe tomorrow. The feeling is that enough tears have now been shed in public. Tim Hewitt, News at 1, Concord, New Hampshire.
A makeshift arena on the grass at Space Headquarters, the families, the engineers, and those who have voted the funding, the children of John F. Kennedy, whose drive sent Americans to the moon. The event watched across America by as many who had watched the deaths they now mourned. And President and Mrs. Reagan in greys and blacks, subdued, here to absorb and coax the emotion towards some kind of resolution. A greeting for Christa McAuliffe's parents, who had watched so publicly their instant loss. The teacher's husband and her 2 children at home far away in New Hampshire. The Reagans flanked by the families, the widow of pilot Mike Smith, her grieving lips struggling for composure. Commander Scobie's widow beside Nancy Reagan, images that children who had watched the fated launch now watched on television across the country as the president led the attempt to move on beyond their loss.
We come together today to mourn the loss of 7 brave Americans, to share the grief that we all feel, and perhaps in that sharing to find the strength to bear our sorrow and the courage to look for the seeds of hope. To those they left behind, the mothers, the fathers, the husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, yes, and especially the children. All of America stands beside you in your time of sorrow. We remember Dick Scobie, the commander who spoke the last words we heard from the Space Shuttle Challenger. We remember Michael Smith, who earned enough medals as a combat pilot to cover his chest, including the Navy Distinguished Flying Cross, 3 Air Medals, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with Silver Star. We remember Judith Resnick, always smiling, always eager to make a contribution. We remember Ellison Onizuka, who was a child running barefoot through the coffee fields and macadamia groves of Hawaii, dreamed of someday traveling to the moon. We remember Ronald McNair. His dream was to live aboard the space station, performing experiments, and playing his saxophone in the weightlessness of space. Well, Ron, we will miss your saxophone, and we will build your space station. We remember Gregory Jarvis. On that ill-fated flight, he was carrying with him a flag of his university in Buffalo, New York. We remember Christa McAuliffe, who captured the imagination of the entire nation. A teacher not just to her students, but to an entire people. On the day of the disaster, our nation held a vigil by our television sets. In one cruel moment, our exhilaration turned to horror. We waited and watched and tried to make sense of what we had seen. Every family member I talked to asked specifically that we continue the program, that is what their departed loved one would want above all else. We will not disappoint them. Man will continue his conquest of space, to reach out for new goals and ever greater achievements. That is the way we shall commemorate our 7 Challenger heroes. We bid you goodbye. We will never forget you.
The memorial service brought to a shattering conclusion by a flypast of astronauts in the missing man formation, one plane peeling off to the heavens. And in the goodbyes for the families, the Reagans expressing emotions that Americans have very publicly yearned to make to the bereaved themselves. Physical support, tears, and a kind of national throat clearing to enable everyone to put the vivid image of the disaster behind them and carry on again. So, as with the bombing of Americans in Beirut, the seizing of American hostages, his own battle with cancer, Ronald Reagan has once again transformed disaster into thoughts of valor and optimism, providing perhaps the clearest insight into the relationship between Ronald Reagan and the heart of America. Jon Snow, News at 10, at the Johnson Space Center in Houston.